And we are live. Prepare theme music.
Prepare to I'm preparing theme music. I always mess it up.
Prepare to play theme music.
Preparing to play theme music.
Play theme music.
Playing theme music.
Individuals, you are charged with capital outside. Every citizen statute approved.
Hey, that was our audience here. 7 people. Ready to go. Okay, well, thank you for joining us today. We have a very special guest with us, Matt Dillahunty. I don't think he needs any introduction. I'm sure everybody out there watching knows who he is. I am Anti-Citizen X, and with me is my good companion, Charkopolis. Say hello to the nice people.
Wait,
Say
who was
hello.
that?
Hello.
We don't know who you wanted to say hello to them.
Charkopolis, please say hello to the nice people.
Hello, nice people.
And Matt Dillahunty, say hello to the nice people.
Hello, other nice people.
Hooray! Okay. So today we're going to be talking about this idea called essentialism. And this is something that's been really kind of festering with me for several months. So I'm really glad to get this opportunity to just get a lot of ideas off my chest. And so that word essentialism, to me, when I hear it, it almost sounds like one of those ivory tower concepts, like postmodern neo-constructivism or transcendentalism.
I don't know. It sounds pretty important. It's essential, right?
Yeah, it's an essential topic in philosophy and academics. And it's actually, when you stop and break it down, it is a very pervasive concept that just permeates all of philosophy and human psychology and human perception even. So we're going to really just break it down to its essence, and see how it applies and where it comes from and how we can sort of break people out of this this fallacious view of the world grounded on this kind of intrinsic psychological bias.
We need Freddie Mercury singing "I Want to Break Free" right now. But and also, I have to send out a warning to my wife. If she's downstairs, honey, you do not want to watch this. This is all about the topics that you despise most. I love you, and we'll talk to you about something else later.
Oh, I love you, baby, but sometimes I just have to talk about essentialism with my friends. So what I think really captures I'm going to have to really fight hard to avoid this pun, but what really captures the essence of essentialism is a philosophical problem called the Theseus paradox. And Wireless Philosophy is another YouTube channel. They have a really great summary of this Theseus problem. So we're more or less going to just kind of go over how they explain it. But it's pretty interesting to think about. And well, we'll just go into it. So let's just imagine you're in ancient Greece. And there is a great hero named Theseus who owns a ship. He's a sailor, maybe a merchant, an adventurer even. So he goes out on lots of wild adventures that probably would make for great blockbuster movies, and they're not really important. He conquers demons and climbs mountains and fights pirates and gets into shootouts with Nazis on the moon, all right? So he has this ship, though, that sails him around the ocean to carry out his adventures with his brave crew. And so after he dies, he's obviously this great hero to his local community. So in commemoration of his fantastic deeds, they turn his ship into a memorial, kind of like a living museum. So they plant the ship in the harbor, and they set up the exhibits, and people are free to come and go and explore the ship and hear about all his crazy adventures. Now the problem with this ship is, as time goes on, it wears down. You know, a few sails here get torn and shredded, a few nails come undone, and some of the lacquer dries out and has to be replaced. So over time, they're taking out bits of the ship and putting it back together. Although for simplicity, they usually like to frame it in just the wood and the planks. So we break the ship down into just these planks of wood, like 1,000 planks that make up this ship. And we could complicate it with the nails and the lacquer and the sails and things, but for simplicity, just think of the planks themselves. The wood rots a little bit, it gets trampled on and cracks, and every now and then, say once per year, a single plank has to be torn out and replaced. So maybe one plank or two here and there is no big deal, but what happens is time just steadily marches on. It's 4 planks, 10 planks, 100 planks. Eventually, 1,000 years go by, and every last plank in this ship has been torn out and replaced. So the question at the end of the day is it still the same ship or not? Is it the Ship of Theseus, or is it something else? When did that transition occur? So before we go on, what are your immediate thoughts on that?
I think part of it, oh, wow. I think part of this is that we're really bad at being clear about what it is that we're talking about. I think that there's a context in which you could say, this is the ship that was, in some respect, in the past, the Ship of Theseus. Even it doesn't matter if every single component. I mean, atoms in our body are going to change. I don't think there's a single atom left in me that was there 7 or 8 years ago. I don't remember the exact number.
I think your bones last the longest, but that neither here nor there.
Well, I smoked for a lot of years, so my lungs might not last the longest. But this is really, I think, more about kind of the shorthand that we use when we're talking about things. But it's a big deal. To me, this is one of my favorite topics because it gets to identity, which is going to be important, once we get to like cloning and things like that, assuming that's even possible. What makes me me? What makes this? And I think there's a context in which we can say, yes, it is the Ship of Theseus, and there's another context in which we can say it's absolutely not the Ship of Theseus. And I recognize that this is labeled a paradox and that there's something paradoxical in there, but I think it's only a paradox in the sense that we're falsely equivocating two different things.
Well, let's talk about some of the sort of the naive solutions to the problem. Like, for example, there's this idea called gradualism, which basically says objects tend to survive gradual change. So, for example, I pull out one plank and I replace it. Well, the greater whole is still the ship, and I pull out another one, and it's still the same ship. I pull out another one and replace it. It's still the same ship. So, gradual itty-bitty changes are basically preserved through an object, and that is kind of intuitive.
That's a version of my own solution. Which, when I say my own solution, I'm not taking credit for this. Other people have had these thoughts, and I'm pretty sure that mine is derived primarily from Dennis Loubet, who I did the nonprofits with for years when we talk about the transporter problem. Mine isn't so much gradualism as it is continuity. That the definition of the label, the definition of the label, what the label points to, changes as the things change within it.
So I think you're getting a little ahead of us.
Okay.
I think that's worm theory is sort of like that. It's gradual. The continuity is the idea for worm theory. That's bullet point number 5. So hold that thought.
So,
but this is like a perfectly intuitive idea. Is you change it a tiny bit and it's still the original thing. It's okay. But there's like variations on this Theseus paradox that kind of throw that idea of gradualism for a loop.
Okay.
So one of my favorite examples is, let's suppose I pull out one plank and I replace it. The question is, what do I do with that old plank? Do I just chuck it in a fire and ignore it? Well, what if I took that plank and built a dry dock right next to the original ship, and every time I pull out a plank from the original, I stick it in the dry dock and start constructing a new ship out of the old parts? So after 1,000 years, essentially what has happened is the old ship just moved to the right like 20 meters, and there's this new ship made out of new parts there. So the question now is like, well, which is the original one? Because according to gradualism, the original ship on the left is technically the Ship of Theseus, even though at the end result is we just moved all the stuff over and intermixed a bunch of stuff in between. So that kind of throws gradualism for a whirl when you start doing ideas like that. Or I think another variation might be, like you said, the transporter problem is you step on the teleporter pad and you break down all your parts and then you rematerialize on a planet.
No, you don't.
Out of completely fresh material, though, right? Or do you? Is that really you if it's completely different atoms?
No, you're dead.
You just died.
That's my take on the transporter thing. You are committing suicide, and a copy of you is being produced.
So you would never step on a transporter, then it sounds like.
Well, I'm not saying that necessarily that I wouldn't. Probably wouldn't. But this gets back to what we were talking about before with this continuity, and there's an aspect of continuity of experience that is broken depending on which version of the transporters you're talking about.
Okay.
Now I'm ahead again.
So that's one of the variations that kind of makes gradualism difficult, though, is if I just gradually take apart all the old stuff and then reassemble it, I now have these copies, and it becomes weird, like which is now the true ship? Because gradualism says that the replacement one is now the true ship, even though all the original material of it just moved over to the left a little bit.
Yes,
So that makes things wacky.
I think that exposes a problem in naive gradualism, or the simplistic version. And I think it tells us something which, I mean, I don't want to like derail the entire conversation with the proposed solution, but ultimately...
Just hold that thought, we'll get to that.
Okay, I'll hold it.
The proposed solution.
So hard.
So another line of thinking just says the object goes where its parts go. So if you take apart the old ship, then reassemble it in dry dock 50 feet to the left, well then now that is the true ship, and this copy is just some copy. It's not really the true ship. And if you take apart all the planks and just burn, then you have this replica, but it's not legitimately the true Ship of Theseus.
Yeah, but the immediate problem I have with that is in the intermittent stages, what are you going to call the true ship?
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. The moment I take out one... Actually, that's our next point, actually. Another view says objects don't survive any change at all. The moment I just tear out one plank, it's something else. It's not the true ship anymore.
But that's a flat denial of any sort of identity, because instantaneously, I mean, if you're going to do that for a big piece, what's the justification for not doing it for a small piece? So as soon as you've got the thing built and label it, before you can finish writing down the label, it's already changed. There are atoms that are leaving, and there's whatever quantum fluctuations of the pattern, however deep you want to go with this. And I think one of the things that makes the gradualism problem kind of interesting is, let's say I dismantled my car into pieces and put them in a box and shipped them overseas. While they're in transit, is that my car? Because does the definition or the label of car actually apply to a collection of parts? And when I reassemble it,
shape you mean?
Sorry?
You mean like the shape of the parts? Just because I scramble the shapes and shook them up in a box,
yeah,
it's still the original car.
Yeah, so then I take it overseas and I reassemble it, and now it's my car again, or maybe it was my car the entire time. So you've got two different things to this gradualism. One is I'm taking my car apart and replacing the pieces, and then taking the pieces that I took off and building a second car, and now you've got which one of those is my car. But then there's the, what if I just took it apart and put it back together? Is it my car the entire time, or did it stop being my car? And that's where I think we're just... The biggest problem is that we're not being specific about what we're labeling. Labels are shorthand.
So another interesting point is, what about just scuffing the atoms? Everybody comes up and walks around the ship, and a few atoms are just kicked overboard. Does that destroy the ship just because you flexed the splint on the wood and just fell off? That seems a little extreme in its interpretation there. So another weird alternative is some people will actually say, you can reject the transitivity of identity, is the way it's described. So what this effectively means is when I take apart the ship and rebuild the new one off to the left, and then I have the copy onto the right, they're actually technically both the true ship. Like, identity doesn't have to be assigned to a single thing. They're just both the Ship of Theseus now. I've created a copy, and there is no true original anymore. They're not the same ship, but they're both the Ship of Theseus.
So just as much as you pick an apple off the tree and then pick another one, they're both apples, but they're different? They're the same but different?
You don't have to have the original doesn't have to be preserved. I can have both ships are the true Ship of Theseus, even though they're different. It's like you can just, that's the Ship of Theseus, and I just have another Ship of Theseus. I made a completely new one. And it's the Ship of Theseus now as well.
I think that would violate the laws of logic.
Maybe it'd be a little confusing, I think, too.
I mean, this is what we're
Interesting.
getting to at the core is, the law of identity. So the law of identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle, these foundational thought, these foundations behind rational thought are encapsulated in a simple Venn diagram where something's either in the circle or it's not in the circle, and nothing's neither or both. And but those laws of thought don't tell us anything specifically about how we go about labeling something. When I talk about the laws of logic or the laws of rational thought, inevitably somebody comes up to me and they're like, yeah, but quantum mechanics, or yeah, but I'm a father and a son. And I'm like, okay, then that's what you're labeling, because these laws don't tell us anything about the content of the labels. And this is what we're talking about with this problem: is how do we go about figuring out the best way to say this is the required content, or is it the fact, or is it the case that this is a generalized label that has some minimal requirements?
Mm-hmm. I like your idea of the Venn diagram, because sometimes they just overlap. You can be a father and a son. They're not exclusive things. Technically, non-contradiction only means you can't be a father and not a father.
Yeah.
And as long as some things can be elements of multiple sets, and that's okay. You just can't be in a set and not in the set simultaneously.
I just don't think I'm a fan of saying. I just don't think I'm a fan of saying that both ships are the true ship of Theseus.
Yeah. I don't really like it either. It is just an interesting alternative. Is just be like, well, let's just mix and match our way logic works a little bit, and just say two things can both be the true ship.
Yeah, I think the true in there is the defeater.
Well, you could replace true with the legitimate ship, maybe, and then you're not trampling on that logical language anymore.
Well, now we're into religion, as to, we are all the one true religion.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, but there's definitely the underlying problem that Matt has already alluded to there, and that is there is a distinct difference between the thing itself and the label we like to call that thing.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you, Segway Dude, because that was kind of my first thought when I first heard the Ship of Theseus story. There's all these interpretations, but there's like this totally obvious solution. And I don't necessarily want to call it a solution, but an obvious point that doesn't really seem to get acknowledged. And to me, the answer is simply there is no Ship of Theseus. When you technically get down to it, there is no ship. There never was a Ship of Theseus. Technically, what we can say is there is this pile of wood and nails and lacquer that we human beings have collectively pointed our fingers at and declared, we shall call this, I dub this, the Ship of Theseus.
Yeah, there is a collection of matter in a specific pattern which we will label Ship of Theseus. And then, as that collection of matter and the pattern changes, we will make decisions about whether or not we will continue to call that the Ship of Theseus or not.
Yeah, perfect. That's a great description. It's just, it is the Ship of Theseus as long as we call it that, and when we just arbitrarily decide to stop calling it that, then it won't be.
Yeah, the only danger in saying there is no Ship of Theseus is it requires a little unpacking and explanation beforehand, because it's going to sound to people like you're denying that there are things.
Yeah, that is true. So that kind of leads us to a particular way of saying this, is that there is no intrinsic essence, essentialism, essence of Theseus that permeates this pile of wood and nails. It's not like the mere virtue of Theseus trampling along it and sailing the world with it just endowed his personal stuff, his essence, into that ship.
Yeah,
and that essence, yeah, go ahead.
No, we imbue that collection and that pattern with the label, with the concept.
Right. A label is, I think, a great, simple way of describing it. And it's kind of interesting to me how just difficult it is to get people to acknowledge that people just label things. We point our fingers at stuff and we just give them names. And sometimes those distinctions are sloppy, and sometimes they're hard and useful.
It's baffling to me how difficult it is to sometimes get that concept across when you observe people not only doing it all the time, but obsessively, especially when it comes to the label mine. That's mine.
Oh, that's actually kind of an interesting, totally side project. Is, what is it? Property, right? well, it's not really this essence of you to it. It's just here's a thing that you can tell others to not touch, and we'll enforce that. But there's no essence of you that says this is yours.
There's a common experience thing to this that ties into the Ship of Theseus, and that is, and it's one of the reasons why I've talked about automobiles. So the government has to deal with this problem of the Ship of Theseus in some respect, which is why my vehicle has a VIN number. And it's just a little tag that is ostensibly permanently affixed to the car, although we know they can be removed. So I've got a VIN number, and just to simplify this, we'll say my VIN number is 1 and your VIN number on your car is 2. As I replace all the parts, I can replace absolutely everything, but as long as that little VIN number label stays there, as far as the government's concerned, that's the same car. Similarly, I could take the VIN number off of my car, put it on your car, argue that I've just essentially done the same thing of replacing all the parts. Now does the government still look at it as if that's my car, or because I've moved the label, does that change things?
That's an interesting thought experiment. Is if I have, a Saturn, or a Prius or something, some cheap sedan car, and I replace every little part in the engines and the tires and the frame and put it all back together into some kind of different car that used to be a little Prius, the government will be like, okay, you replace the engine, you replace the windows, but it's still the same car. But if I just simply switch tags with another vehicle, which is effectively all I've done, or I just have another unlicensed vehicle like a Corvette now, and I take off the plate and attach it to that car, now all of a sudden it's a completely different car. Even though if I had replaced every part one by one to create an effective Corvette out of it, that would have been okay. But just simply doing it in one step is apparently not okay.
Yeah, and I think actually you'd get in trouble too. So there's limits on, and now we're into law stuff, but there's limits on how much you can legally modify your car and what changes you can make and still make it drivable, and how your insurance company is going to view it. If you buy a 4-door sedan and modify it into a 2-door sports car with a massive engine, you could probably get away with it for a long time of saying, hey, the VIN number says that, this is a rust bucket 4-door.
Right.
But once the insurance company and perhaps the government find out about it, they may, what they may do, and I don't know, is the VIN number on register is registered as with a certain list of minimal characteristics. This is a Toyota 4-door blah blah blah, and that's associated in a database with your VIN number. And as those things change, you need to change them gradually.
Gradually, yeah.
In order to maintain that.
Huh.
Okay.
That's interesting.
Then, first off, Matt, how did you know the VIN number to my car? That was uncanny.
I am a psychic.
2.
2.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
So that starts making me thinking, how slow, how gradual of these changes would I need to make in order to skirt by any sort of laws? Like if I do all of the changes immediately, yeah, that's probably going to raise some eyebrows. But if I do it over the course of 10, 15 years, is it just that
people actually have done similar things? Like there was, I think, a story, maybe there's a song about it by Johnny Cash about how he worked at a car factory, and once a month he would just smuggle out a bolt or a carburetor or a tire, and after like 20 years of working at this place, he got himself a brand new Chevrolet piece by piece.
The cool thing is not only because that's Johnny Cash is one of my favorites, and that's a favorite song of mine. But I watched when I was a kid, I think for the Grammys or something, they put together one of the first music videos, and it was a video for that song, and they actually constructed a car that was a rough approximation, with one headlight on the left and 2 on the right, and all this stuff. Yeah, it's Johnny Cash knows all about essentialism.
So bring us back in. So this is kind of the idea of essentialism is people look at objects in the world and they just can't help. They can't resist endowing the world, rocks and trees and clouds, with these distinct essences.
Mm-hmm.
There's a very specific collection of things that make a cloud, and a very specific other collection of things that make a tree, and a rock, and a person. And we're just and that's okay to a point, but there's almost this tendency to say we can't violate those distinctions either.
Well, it's not only not okay, it is essential. I mean, we can't communicate if we don't do that. Communication this conveyance of ideas between people, and if the sounds or words that we're using don't point to the same or similar objects between us, then we can't communicate.
That's a good point too. Is it's not like the bad thing. It is a very useful tool. When I say here's a rock, you have some general picture of traits that you associate with that word.
Yeah, and it's not the same as soup. And if you point to soup and say that's a rock, I'm going to say you're wrong. And we do that, and what it does is it convinces us that words have meaning intrinsically, and I think that's utterly false. Words have usages. Over time, the usage of the word rock and the word soup could swap, as long as everybody is in agreement about it. It's a convention.
Not to mention different languages, completely different words pointing to exactly the same thing.
Yes, which is why a lot of the Asian restaurants around here have names that are incredibly amusing, especially if they're serving pho, because there's a place that's just called Pho King, and they're doing it on purpose, so there's a little bit of fun there. But
so that's actually a good example of how you can abuse this concept of essentialism. It's useful, but it's also important to realize it is still fundamentally this arbitrary practice of pointing our fingers and giving labels. In my experience, Christians in particular seem to think that words are absolute. And we'll talk a little bit. Here's a great example of kind of that, taking this idea to an extreme. So a good question is, when is a human officially a human, as opposed to a blob of cells and gametes and haploids? So, or a related question might be, what's the difference between abortion and murder?
So one of the things here is that you said, when is a human, and I think that what you're talking about is, when is a human a person? Because there's this idea of an issue of personhood, but I think that personhood is a big red herring in discussions about abortion, but I guess we can get into that when you...
Or if I say it more technically, when does a blob of DNA and mitochondria and water officially become a person endowed with rights and protection under the Constitution?
Yeah, and I don't think that matters. I don't think it matters to the issue of abortion, because we could grant that I already grant that what is growing in the womb is in fact human in the sense of DNA, and living in the sense that it's growing. I don't think that most of the, prior to brain activity or whatever argument you want to make, that it counts as a person, but I'm going to set that aside as completely irrelevant, because even if it was a person, now what you have is you have two people whose rights are in conflict, and the person in the womb does not have the right to use that womb without the consent of the person who owns it. So that, for me, abortion is entirely about bodily rights and bodily autonomy.
Which valid argument.
Way of looking at it that I kind of view as an important point that doesn't seem to get acknowledged as much as it should be, is when exactly that fetus officially becomes a person is still fundamentally arbitrary.
Yeah.
When we officially declare you are now a person and killing you would be murder, that is whenever we collectively decide it ought to be. It's not as if there's this intrinsic essence of person that just comes into existence when two haploid cells fuse together. You just have two half chromosomes suddenly bonding to create a unique chain of chromosomes in DNA. Like, is that, does a unique strand of DNA automatically qualify as a person? Why would that be?
That same arbitrariness about when we call something a person applies to murder as well, because murder is actually a legal term of when it is illegal to kill a human being. And so that is just something that we've decided. We've gone around, like the Bible, this is one of the things I criticized, was thou shalt not kill. It's an incredibly simplistic thing that doesn't give you much information. Whereas what we've done since then, in the intervening thousands of years, is said, okay, in what situations is it permissible for one person to end the life of another versus when is it not? And so murder is the label for those instances where it's illegal.
Yeah.
And there are situations where it's not. So, I mean, if you want to say what's the distinction between murder and abortion, well, on some level you're saying one is illegal and one is legal.
Yeah, that's a good point. Is the distinction is whenever the law and police officers decide to enforce it, which is whenever we as voters collectively enact legislation that says so.
Yeah, because I can kill people in self-defense. I can kill people in times of war. The state kills people when they're
Capital punishment.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And none of those are murder, although people will argue that they should be considered murder, and they're basically saying we should not allow this.
Right, and these are all perfectly great arguments, but like I said, there's this problem of essentialism is people tend to view their particular perspective as the objectively correct one, when really it's just a matter of when are we going to decide to give these labels to certain actions.
Yeah,
So again, essentialism is there, and it's okay, it's just you got to recognize it for what it is before you can continue. Otherwise, you just have people saying, I think it's murder to kill a fetus, and the other guy says, I think it's not. Now what? Who's right?
Once again, everyone needs to recognize that these are arbitrary labels that everyone's assigning, where they're not mutually inclusive.
I think a good point Matt brought up is this idea of, is murder objectively wrong? Well, this kind of takes us to this idea of moral realism, which is, again, a form of essentialism, where moral realists look at moral actions as having this objectively intrinsic rightness and wrongness to them that is beyond argumentation. But they don't seem to realize murder is exactly what you said. Murder is when we've collectively declared it to be illegal and will punish you for engaging that action.
See, now here's where we're going to part company.
Okay.
Because while what we decide to label as a matter of law as murder is cultural, subjective, all of these things, it's what we have become convinced of. That doesn't mean that there isn't a fact to be discovered about what things should fall under that label, what is in our best interest to label this way. And my view, and I'm mostly in line with Sam Harris, not entirely on morality, is that we're physical beings in a physical universe, and that there is nothing else. So this isn't an appeal to essentialism, it's not an appeal to dualism or anything else, but there are objective facts to discover about the consequences of our actions, what those consequences are for each of us individually and us as a society, and that there are truths to be discovered about what is in fact in our best interest, not claiming that we have them. And so based on that, I have no problem saying that the facts of the universe show that it is objectively not in our interest to murder people.
So you're exactly right. When you say we part ways, but actually that's kind of a segue, or actually a complete tangent, but I'm a consequentialist too. You can objectively speak of consequences to actions. And if given certain desires, certain consequences will objectively meet those goals or they won't. And that, to me, is a far more coherent way to talk about morality than just saying X is right because the universe has permeated it with this essence of goodness.
And I think almost everybody's on board to this to some level. The departure comes when whether or not the foundational values, the thing that because you can make an objective assessment about anything. You play chess. The rules of chess are essentially arbitrary, but you can make an assessment of a move to find out whether or not it is legal or illegal or right or wrong with respect to those rules. The question then becomes, do the foundational values that we hold, are those objectively discoverable, or are they purely constructs? And my position is that they are also objectively discoverable because, chopping your head off, I can't think of any circumstance, and nobody's been able to show a circumstance where that's good for you.
No, that's a good point, and I agree, and I even have a whole 20-minute video that more or less rants on about everything you've just said. So
yeah, but it's not essentialism.
It's got to stick to essentialism here. So
we will save that conversation for another time.
So back to this idea of what's the difference between abortion and murder. A common fallacy is to say that there's this distinct essence of humanity that endows a fetus that suddenly means it is now a person, like objectively. It's not just that we've decided to call it a person and enforce it as having rights. It objectively, somehow this essence of person came into it. A blob of cells is now officially a person and not just this blob of mass growing inside of a womb.
Yeah, and so, I don't have so much a problem with the conclusion. It's the way they arrive at the conclusion. Yeah, so I don't think that there's an essence that comes into it. I think that we just reach a point where, aha, this is now what we're going to call this. Just like if you're baking a cake, there's eggs and flour and whatever other crap goes into a cake, and you put it into a pan and you stick it in the oven. Well, one of the common little questions people ask is, what do you put in a toaster? And some people will say toast, and the answer is no, you put bread in a toaster and toast comes out. But there's a problem with that, in that when you put that batter into the oven, you don't say, I have batter in the oven. You say, I'm baking a cake. And at some point in that process, it goes from being batter to cake, and it's not defined. Because you can get a cake that's just not cooked all the way, and you say, this is a cake, but it's not, it's still gooey in the middle. and now you're getting to that point of, how many grains of sand constitute a pile?
Yeah, that's a great point. Is the gradualism fallacy is some people will say, a baby is officially a person the moment it comes out of the womb. Well, then, why not 2 minutes before or 10 minutes? But the moment you grant that little bit,
you're dealing with an objective event where we can agree, yes, this birth happened.
It's an objective event, but why should simply pulling a baby 3 feet to the left suddenly make it a baby and having rights versus not?
And actually, if you go back to ancient times when Jews were doing a census, babies didn't count until they were, a month or so old, because the infant mortality didn't count them.
Just like the Spartan thing, where if you didn't like it, you're like, I hate this thing. You could throw it in a pile and no one would care.
Well, there was an interesting post on some site that I won't go to, where a commenter said something about if babies were born and men had to give them blood transfusions for the first 3 months. It was kind of how would this change our perception of it? Now, first, set aside the fact that this is impossible. Humanity couldn't have survived because we didn't have the capability. But let's say there's a natural mechanism, a tube that we all have. And so I have sex with a female, and we produce offspring. And in order for that offspring to continue to survive, I must actually voluntarily provide it with something of me for 2-3 months, whatever it is. We'll just do it 9 months so that we're sharing the burden equally. Now, that would fundamentally change how we view all of these things, including when we start to label something a person, and when, if I impregnate someone and then I die and I'm the only one, did that woman have a child or not? And even though this is a completely fanciful, thought experiment, I think it's interesting in that it also gets to this key of identity and when do we label something. Granted, it's a hypothetical, but I thought about it for about an hour and a half last night. I was like,
so is it kind of like saying, if I had to give blood transfusions to a baby for 9 months, would that mean we would be inclined to not really call it a baby until it's done with the transfusions?
It might be, and what it does is the world is inherently unfair to the genetic fathers of offspring in humans. As much as I'm not a fan of MRAs, there are men's rights issues that come up with regard to, why don't I have any say in this? And the big answer is, well, you don't. Tough. Because this is just the way biology works. You don't get a say in this. Mm-hmm. But this was an artificially constructed scenario such that there could be a say in it. And the people who were pro-choice would be like, we would legislate as a requirement that if you impregnated someone, you would have to donate that blood for 9 months. And they were trying to present this as if it was intuitively obvious. And my response was, no, I don't think we would, because I think that violates bodily autonomy and individual rights and freedoms in the same way that forcing somebody to remain pregnant does.
Okay. So back to essentialism here.
Yes, thank you.
See what I did there? So this actually, I think, a Christian answer, I'm surprised they don't really bring this up more often, but I think it's floating in the back of their mind, is the baby is officially a person when a soul enters it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, this is me hypothesizing, this is actually where the idea of a soul comes from. Is there's this distinct essence of a person that comes into you that makes you a person, as opposed to just this blob of meat.
And for the Jews, it happened at birth when you brought in your first breath. That was the breath of life, and it goes back to when God breathed the breath of life into Adam.
Is that like when the soul officially like
yes
pushes into your face and permeates your body?
Yeah, which is why a lot of Jewish culture doesn't have a problem with abortion. And so this
Really?
idea changes over time because of passages like Jeremiah 1:5 where God says, "I knew you before you were born," and they misuse that thing to say, well, the soul enters the fetus at conception, which
That's
I
actually an interesting point. Is
don't care about. But
what if there was no soul in that fetus until after it took its first breath? Would that change most Christian and pro-lifers' opinion on the matter? If you could objectively say, no, there is no soul in this thing, it's just a blob of meat, a soul has not entered it, would it still be murder to terminate it? I suspect they'd say no.
I think that on an intellectual level, they would probably say no.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a problem that, setting aside all the metaphysics and theology, we have an evolved, knee-jerk emotional reaction to death and violence and killing and all this other stuff. And even if they were convinced that there was no soul there, I think probably most of them at a visceral level would object and then argue that, but you're denying it the opportunity for a soul. And in the same way they would use potential life, they would use potential souled person,
Okay.
and maintain their position, I suspect.
Okay. But in any case, this is where I think intuitively, though, this idea of a soul is, if I'm not mistaken, is fairly common across a lot of cultures, isn't it? Like you could go to, some cannibal tribe in Indonesia, and they probably have this idea of a soul as well. Like I believe some cultures would actually have this idea of you'd kill an enemy and eat his heart, and that you would absorb his strength.
You would take on his essence.
Yeah.
So there's the Paraha in South America who have no concept of a god or supernatural or souls. I think they are an extreme exception, and that by and large, at least to the extent, I'm no expert in anthropology or anything else, but to the extent that I've looked into this, it seems that there's some idea of a soul that permeates almost all cultures, not all, but almost all. And I'm okay with a poetic, metaphoric sense of the human spirit, the human soul, that sense. I just don't use it very often because it ends up being muddied by religious claims and supernatural claims about, Cat, you're going to see if you take a picture of me, you're taking my soul. That's the essence.
So let's try another example here. One more that's more recent is, what is marriage? When is it when is a marriage officially a marriage as opposed to just two people shacking up together? Or three people, or a man and a pig? Why does one get to be marriage but not the other?
Because we say so.
And that's our answer, but again, you can kind of see the psychology of alternative viewpoints where they really want marriage to be one man and one woman. Like, that's just what it is, and it can't not be anything different.
Yeah, that's it. That is the same kind of appeal to words have intrinsic definitions that are unalterable, and it's just a denial of truth. And it's also, they accept that words mean different things. They understand that there are different languages. They understand that the meaning of words changes over time. They're just resistant to what they think this word should mean.
Or just it means something different than what they want it to mean, so therefore it's objectively wrong.
Yeah, and it baffles me because, the entire time that this conversation was going on before the Supreme Court ruled, I had a number of arguments with, Christians who were opposed to it, and one of them tried to argue on purely secular grounds, which turned out to be really bad for them. But the rest of them are all arguing from this, well, this is what God wants. Okay, but for example, you live in the United States, we have a constitution that is under no obligation to care about what you think God wants or what God wants,
right,
or what your book says or what you think your book says. Meanwhile, they are constantly pointing to biblical marriage. Well, biblical marriage is one man, one woman, and concubines and extra wives.
Yeah.
The whole
So
women aren't people, they're property.
Yeah.
Notion. Yeah.
And that's kind of a funny point when you bring in the Bible. Yeah, women were basically property. They're not really people. I
Yep.
think there's an old expression I've heard people say is like in the Roman Latin language, the word for wife and slave were equivalent. I don't know if that's true or not, but I've heard it said as kind of a joke even. But I mean, now does that make it okay to kill my slave if it's really just my property? It's not a person. And this was a common theme in the antebellum South. You know, a slave wasn't a person; it was 3/5 of a person. It has person attributes.
No, actually, so the 3/5 of a person thing, the 3/5 compromise, isn't actually from the South or the valuation of that. It is entirely something that was put in as a compromise with regard to voting.
Right.
I used to say pretty much the same thing about the Constitution referring to slaves as 3/5 of a person. That's an assessment for census and districting, which was actually put in place to keep the South from taking over and
Mm-hmm.
But so it's not really.
They were trying to have their cake and eat it too. They wanted to claim slaves were property, but they also wanted them to count towards representation in Congress.
Yeah.
So that was sort of the compromise. Like, you can't have both of those things. They're either property or they're people. So it was just sort of deemed by demographic consensus that, well, they're like 3/5 of a person.
Well,
That's the number they came up with.
They could for all the way up to the Civil War. They did have their cake and eat it too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And see the reason I'm so kind of sketchy on this is I hear it come up. It's like, oh, the U.S. valued blacks and slaves as 3/5 of a person. Quite frankly, I wouldn't have made the compromise. I would have kept them at 0/5, saying no, until you free them, until you stop treating them like chattel, they're not going to get to vote. Because there's this sense of coercion in voting where, hey, you guys are my slaves, so you're going to go vote the way I tell you, or I'm going to beat you. And so in that context, I can't see valuing them at all for that, because all it does is lose you the battle, and I wouldn't have been any good at coming up with a 3/5 compromise.
I think that was the idea. Is the North wanted them to count as 0 because they said, they're your property. You don't get to count them towards your demographics.
Yep.
Because they didn't want the South to have power in Congress. So that was the compromise. Well, the South wanted them to count as people, but then not give them any rights of people.
Yeah,
It's a big, wonderful, logical clusterfuck that comes out of that.
My slaves count as people to the extent that it's beneficial to me.
Yeah, exactly. So where were we? Sorry, that was a nice sidetrack. But yeah, like, if you're just going to call a woman a slave, well, is it wrong to kill your property? If I just pick up this chair here and smash it, was that murder? It wasn't a person.
Yeah, and so the Bible's take on it was you can beat your slaves as long as they don't die within a couple of days.
Oh, that's a good point too. You could beat your slave. So that's the idea of, they're like half measures. They're like a person, but they're not completely. So you kind of have to treat them like a person. You don't have to treat them like a complete person.
Yeah.
So what is, like, their soul is like some kind of gimpy, retarded soul that isn't really an official soul. They have soul-like essences that God still wants to look after.
Well, now we're into the whole idea of othering and divisiveness, where anybody who isn't like me doesn't count, and this plays into identity and the labeling. I think mostly in the sense that it's a baggage product of the same sort of thought that allows us the magical thinking behind, well, you're going to talk about sweaters, but also autographs and collector's editions and things like that, where we look at something different because of its history and because of its value to us.
Thank you, segue dude. So this brings us to our next talking point, which is a really interesting application of how essentialism just makes people act weird. So there's a guy called Professor Bruce Hood who likes to do these public lectures, and he's written a couple of books and articles. But his interesting spiel is he'll go before an audience, and he'll just present this sweater, a cardigan sweater, and he says, this used to belong to a serial killer. I think it was Fred Phelps, if I'm not mistaken.
No, Fred Phelps is not a serial
No,
killer.
some other guy. Wait, I got the article here.
Fred Phelps was the leader of the Westboro Baptist Church who died a year or so ago. His son is a good friend of mine, and
Fred West. That's the.
okay.
Excuse me. So Fred West. He has this cardigan that belonged to Fred West.
Yeah, the Phelps have enough baggage without labeling them as serial killers.
So, and he says, this guy, he used to wear it around his house, and when he killed people, he might have even had this sweater on once or twice. But don't worry, I've taken it to the laundromat, I've steam cleaned it, I bleached it, I've completely removed every last atom of Fred West that has ever touched this sweater. So all you need to know is he used to wear it, but I've completely cleaned it and sterilized it. But it still used to belong to a serial killer. So who wants to wear this sweater? And what's interesting is most people, and like myself included, I feel this urge to sort of cower away from it. Like, ew, I don't want to touch that thing. Just throw it in a fire and get rid of it. So this is an interesting aspect of essentialism, where not only do things have a particular essence, but it's almost as if that essence is contagious. That if you put on this Hitler sweater, I like to call it the Hitler sweater, because you can almost do the same thing with, here is a shirt that Hitler wore. Would you wear it? Most people just, no, they don't want to touch it. Like, you'll get essence of Hitler on you, and it might turn you into a Jew-hating psychopath if you touch it. So it's interesting. Like, people really don't want to put this sweater on. They cower away from it. But of course, even in a group of 100 people, there's always that one or two smart asses who are like, I'll put it on. And the guy will put it on, and be like, yeah, this is kind of cozy. And then he'll sit back down, and like the people who sat next to him will like shoosh away from him and like, ew, you'll get away from me, you crazy person. They'll even look at the person who wears it as somehow being tainted. So this to me is an application of how essentialism kind of can get weird. So you can call it like contagious, the contagiousness of essentialism, or essential contagions. But what are your thoughts on that?
So I wouldn't object at all to wearing it. I don't know if it's just a matter of I've completely freed myself of at least this aspect of essentialism, but it doesn't fade. I know there are some people who would be eager to wear it.
And that kind of like makes you uncomfortable on some level. You're like, why would you want to wear it? Like, I'd maybe do it, on a bed if I had to, or but there'd still be that little voice in my head who'd be like, you probably should not get too cozy.
Yeah. So while I have no personal objections to wearing it myself, I think that there's probably still a part of me that would look at somebody who was eager to put it on with suspicion. And it's not necessarily that I think, oh my gosh, they're an essentialist who think that they're going to get, so now I need to be nervous that they want to be a serial killer. That's one aspect of it. But it's entirely possible that somebody could be eager to put it on to show that, hey, yeah, there's nothing to this. I mean, I don't know why you guys are making such a big deal out of it. Look, I got the sweater on. I'm not killing people. But it's hard to get away from it.
Yeah, as much as I'd want to throw in there, I mean, come on, people, it's just a sweater. It's not the serial killer, it's just a sweater. I mean, you could set up an easy little, mind game with people and say, here's two sweaters. Here, person A put this sweater on. Here's an identical sweater. I can say I bought them from the same store. They both put the sweater on, and then you could reveal, aha, one of them was the serial killer sweater. Hoo-hoo, which one is it?
And if you don't tell them which is which, they probably would both get very uncomfortable.
And I hate to say this, but I think that would be a terribly immoral thing to do. It's because there are people, if you take some action along those ways, not knowing what people are going to think, you could potentially traumatize someone. Yes, it's their own fault or their own issue, but I think that people would look at that as really kind of skeezy.
And yeah, there I'd say there's the problem. The fact that you can predict this kind of behavior out of humans shows you how much of a psychological issue that we have with this. And then you have the second reveal. Aha! No, really, they were just sweaters from department stores. You really weren't. But the reaction, it's so predictable.
Now, another interesting idea is how you can't get the essence out of it either. You can say, I washed it, I bleached it. Like, what do I have to do to get this Hitler essence out of the sweater?
What you have to do is replace it thread by thread until it's a different sweater.
Like, I think there may be even this idea of like cursed items is
Yeah.
where it comes from. And there's apparently like cleansing rituals. You have to sprinkle the holy water and pray for it, and then maybe Jesus can remove curses from things. But you can kind of see how this extends to a lot of various cultural ideas too.
So in the realm of mental magic or the psychic entertainers thing, there's a number of different effects, and one of them, you move things with your mind and read minds and control minds, but there's one called psychometry, which is this idea that you can pick up intuitions and things from an object, and even purely skeptical, diehard, there's no supernatural performers will include bits of this, like without being explicit. It's not like, give me your grandmother's hanky and I will tell you about your grandmother. That's what some psychic performers will do. But instead it'll be like, okay, I want you to write this down and put it in an envelope, and then I'm going to take the envelope and I'm going to feel some impression. There's some essence of what you wrote, even though they're using, some perfectly mundane method. They still do this because it resonates with people. People seem to think that this is at least within the realm of possibility, and there's something about that it may have a lingering energy, psychic energy of some sort. But the example that I was talking about earlier, or with you earlier, is autographs.
Yeah, I was just going to bring that up. It's not necessarily a bad thing that we do this. There's some things we do that are fun, is collecting things, autographs, like you said.
And first editions of books, ancient books, and it's, you can pay $1 gazillion for a first edition, Discovery of Witchcraft, or you can read the content for free online. Now, what's the difference between the two, apart from that, you actually have a physical book in your hands? That's, we can talk about the differences there, but you can get a physical printout of the content as well. So there's something about having this, bound issue from 1540 whatever, that has significance to us, and I think it may be a different significance than is truly essentialism. I think in those cases, it's not that we think that there's an essence, of this, but now we're pointing to the history of the object, that this was actually, printed all those years ago and managed to survive, and it was a significant book, and it's amazing that it's made it this far. And now, instead of talking about something magical, we're talking about something that is mundane, but yet we still care about. That's still, important to us in some respect.
Well, it is fair that a lot of the artifacts we make don't usually last very long. So there is that distinction that can be made. But yeah, in the end, it is just a book, and we've preserved all the knowledge of that book. The thing we found important about it, we've made 1 million copies of it, so that we don't lose it.
But there's two things we found important about it. There's the content thing we found important about it, and then there's the history that we found important about it, and that is in and of itself intangible. And so we attach that to the book or the autograph or whatever it is that you happen to collect.
Sure, and and there you go. That's why you want original first edition.
Yeah, and so this is, we kind of glimpsed past the worm theory / continuity thing. I don't know when we're going to get back to it. I don't think it applies here, but for some reason this reminds me of that the book has a continuity, not of experience, because a book doesn't experience, but of experiences that can be tied to this, like whose hands did this pass through, whose shelf was this on, who read it, who did it influence.
Actually, that's an interesting point. You kind of brought back a throwback here to the Ship of Theseus again. Is the thing to remember is, there is no essence of Theseusness that you can measure. It's really all in our minds. So an interesting question might be something like this. Let's suppose everybody in this ship museum is preserving the ship as best as they can, but one day a plague comes through and kills everybody in the region. And all of that history and that knowledge about what the ship is and what its significance is and who Theseus was just dies. Now and then another group of a tribe, 10 years later, comes into the same region and just sees this ship sitting in the harbor, they will have no clue why that ship was significant. They'll just see a ship. And to them, it will just be a ship. And they'll probably be more than happy to tear it apart and burn it for firewood. So that really kind of, to me, reinforces this point, is that there's no objective essence to a lot of these things. It really is just all in our minds.
Well, I don't know.
We just decide it shouldn't be, then that's just when it happens.
Yeah, I mean, I take your point, but I'm not necessarily sure that if somebody else were coming along, they'd be so eager to just dismiss it, because we do have this curiosity. And so if you came along a ship and a bunch of people who were dead, so they couldn't tell you about anything about it, there would be this curiosity that I think we have to investigate it, to try to find out. We need to know why was this ship here, and what happened, and all that stuff. So that's kind of a side aspect of this. We are so curious, and we abhor ignorance. And your point is still good, that they don't have the same reasons to maintain it, but there may be some reasons.
And that is a good point too. Is it is a pervasive bias in human psychology. Depending on the culture, though, it may or may not be significant. If you are just coming in and it's a harsh winter and you just need firewood, you might just be inclined to just screw that ship. We need some wood. But really, if you're a little more culturally and historically minded, you might say, well, there's this ship here. It seems to be significant to the people who were here before us. Let's ask why. And then you kind of are regenerating that significance again from scratch. So it kind of can go both ways.
Yeah, for me, when it moves beyond, so this whole issue of trying to figure out what are the minimum characteristics that we are going to say are a necessary requirement for this label. And I do this, with respect to gods when we're talking about religion. If you say, what does God mean? What does that label point to? Well, it's something different for almost everybody. Mm-hmm. And there's the classical theism, and then there's deism, and there's independent denominations and what their doctrines have had to say about God. And so everybody has like this different idea. And yet, I think I'm not a theological non-cognitivist like Pilucci and others who think that the term is meaningless. I think that while it is varied in its use, that there's some minimal set of characteristics that we would probably agree need to be in place before any of us would really justify calling something a god. That it needs to be a thinking agent who is powerful or capable of doing things that humans aren't. What exactly those characteristics are, we may not know.
Well, you're kind of just throwing back to this idea of labelism. I guess we need a name. What do you call us? Where it's not essentialism, but just the arbitrary label property is, what is God? What does that word mean? And it's important to recognize there's no objectively correct definition. There is, however, a general tendency for us to really need to communicate. And so when we use words, we just agree in advance this set of properties will define this particular word so that we know it when we see it.
And this is a conflict I get into with theists. The idea that because something doesn't have intrinsic meaning or intrinsic value, they think the conclusion is that it is therefore meaningless and valueless. And my contention is that no. Meaning and value are things that we apply to things, and so the fact that it doesn't have an intrinsic, nobody out there cares about this ace of spades of mine, but this could be a very significant thing to me, and so it has meaning and value to me, and that's what all of life's about, is figuring out, okay, this is how I value this item. How do you value this item, and where can we agree? Because you can't buy and sell without that.
You're right. I've actually encountered this exact same bias in a lot of Christian arguments I've had. Is they honestly think words have objective meaning, that their definition is the right one. You should and it can't possibly be different.
When I debated Psi, in the middle of that, I included a little comment that words don't have intrinsic meanings, that they have usages. And the Christians in the audience lost their minds and laughed and scoffed and even came up during the Q&A afterwards to be like, well, you're the guy who think words don't mean things. And I'm like, I just wasn't quite, I didn't quite expect there to be that much pushback, which shows just how big of a deal this is.
Well, I think something I was thinking is it's almost like essentialism being applied to language itself. Because again, human beings can't help but look at the world as in have everything having this very distinct essence that makes it what it is. And it's almost like they're translating that to words themselves, that when you say right and wrong, there's this objective rightness and wrongness to things. And the word you use for God, there's a right definition and a wrong definition.
It drives me crazy because they know if you ask them, okay, the word computer, it used to mean, or a calculator used to mean an actual person doing it.
Yeah, a person who would scribble arithmetic on a piece of paper in a room.
Now it means the app on your phone, most likely. Mm-hmm. Prior to that, it meant the actual handheld device. Prior to that, it meant a person. And prior to that, the word did not exist. We invented a word through, manipulation of other words and sounds and things like that in order to describe a concept. And it's the concepts that matter, which is why it doesn't matter if you speak English, French, Portuguese, Russian, Spanish, whatever. This is why we can communicate because, oh, you're using this label for this concept and I'm using this label for this concept, so now we can talk about it.
Yeah, I want to say it's really not that hard of a concept to allow people to grasp, but really if you want to say this word really means that, like with the word God, well then what if I break it down into its constituent letters? Where'd the meaning go? It's the adjacency of letters that makes it all work again? What's in there?
Yeah, I've called it magical thinking before, this idea that a collection of letters or phonemes, like especially when you talk about offensive language, and I'm a big proponent of offense being something that's taken and not given, although you can have an intent for someone to take something offensive. But the idea that, fuck, it is just the worst thing you could ever say, that this, oh my gosh, you uttered this sound.
Oh, it has the vapors.
And so I had a woman hang up on the phone. She called into the show, and she was concerned about our immortal souls and how we were going to go to hell, and this was important. And so we had this long discussion, and she made arguments that we responded to, and she kind of backed herself into a corner, and then she said something like, well, you believe what you believe, and I believe what I believe. I guess it doesn't matter. I'm like, well, then why the fuck did you call? And she got outraged, as if there's a difference between cursing at someone and disparaging them, and just using it in language as an expletive for emphasis. And it was so funny to me that people seem to have this magical reaction that this word carries so much weight. And we do it with other things, and all of us will do it with, for example, the N-word, and some with the C-word or C-words. And I'm not a fan of the magical thinking, but I understand that this is the way people operate, and so if you're going to communicate with people effectively and you don't want to have problems, then you do avoid certain things, even though idealistically we shouldn't.
Stop saying things that I agree with you with. How am I supposed to...
I'm sorry. It's because you're brilliant.
So here's an interesting question. Is as much as we're harping on this idea of magical thinking and essentialism, what are some instances where it might actually be beneficial and useful to think this way?
Yeah, I think the first thing that pops to mind is this idea of family. Jen Peoples on the show has said, "You're family if you act like family," and it has nothing to do with whether you're kin or blood related. And I'm a huge fan of that. There are members there are people who are related to me that don't feel like family and don't operate like family. They've cut me off, and there are people who are no more related to me than anybody else is, who are definitely family. And there's something potentially magical thinking, or perhaps essential, about this notion of family. And I'm not saying that relationships aren't real; they are, but there's a value there. There's a value for the child who's born with this implicit kind of propensity to accept the authority of parents, and ultimately this authority goes way wrong and leads us down a horrible track later on. but during the nurturing phase, it's probably a good thing for these fallacious arguments of authority, this idea that this person is just to be accepted, which is a form of magical thinking, is probably a good thing most of the time.
Well, I'd say at least from an evolutionary standpoint, you want to learn from the things that have survived long enough to have progeny.
Yeah.
So, good or bad, that's what apparently works.
But also, I think you talk about essentialism. It drives economy, which does good. I mean, there's a market for collector's items. Although what we've seen is that when you intentionally try to make collector's items, they're invariably less valuable.
But yeah, that's what always gets me is presidential pens. When something goes into law, you have the pen that signs it into law finally. But no, it's not just one pen. You have a whole set of 10 or 20 pens, so you can do one letter at a time, so you have collectible items instead of just the one. But really, it's not the pen. It's the ink that really got to the paper that made it But everyone wants to have a pen.
Yeah, not only that, but, in this Ship of Theseus thing, if your normal signature that's authorized is something that is continuous, where you do it with one pen, if you instead do it with a whole bunch of different pens, putting down individual letters and stuff, is that actually your signature?
Or even presidents like to use an auto pen because they have a machine that you have authorized. This is my signature, and it will duplicate your signature exactly. And you say, "Yep, that's me," because I authorize it to be.
And it's not valued the same.
And it's not valued the same.
Yeah.
Because your hand didn't touch it. Well, I'm trying to ask though, what are some useful ways of thinking essentially? Because you can kind of just imagine yourself, some hunter-gatherer culture out on the savannah. There's certain value in understanding that rocks are not like twigs. One thing has properties that are useful in making fire and spears, and another thing is useful in making the spear tip or in hurling at stuff, right? And essentialism is essentially this act of looking at stuff in your environment and looking for common features and then lumping those collections of features into very distinct sets.
I think
that's very useful for navigating the world.
Well, I think that what we're talking about as far as usefulness is that we're talking about useful in the sense of generalizing, the sense of analogy and metaphor, and that it's because this is so useful. So we don't have time to become experts on everything, and we don't have time to communicate by explaining every single concept. A short sentence that can be offered in 4 or 5 words, provided we have similar understanding, could take a book to properly explain that single sentence if we were having to go back to rudimentary, okay, this is what this letter is, this is what this letter is, and when you combine them this way, it's this. If we have to teach everything, and so we live our daily lives by induction and inference, that today is pretty much the same as yesterday. And I don't just mean that in the sense that things work the same, but we generalize all the time as a matter of necessity. If we were to be fully kind of explicit, analytical about everything, we would die off.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's not like essentialism is all bad. It's a very useful tool in psychology for lumping things in accordance with like properties and what you can expect them to do when you commit to actions.
Yep. The problem is when we extend it. Yeah, the problem is when we extend it beyond the metaphor, beyond the analogy, when we argue from analogy to specifics.
Yeah, this just reminds me of this reminds me of Bertrand Russell, who studied the foundations of mathematics and set theory, and really wanted to prove that 1 + 1 = 2, because by this point everyone's taken it for word.
Yep.
And it took he and a buddy of his about 10 years to make a book called Principia Mathematica, which I think about 10 people read, but it's a tome. That is a thick book of him trying to demonstrate the simplest of things.
Yeah.
Again, 10 years.
Quine and others did a lot of work in language.
Yeah. But really, that's what a lot of the work comes in, where you are trying to assign a label to a referent and really trying to get down to the nitty-gritties of these things. It gets complicated, and it's just easier to just smooth it over.
It's a reason people hate philosophy and hate philosophers.
Oh yeah, like the basic
Why
thing.
can't you guys
That's a
just
chair.
talk like normal people?
Yeah, like yeah. I had the freshman philosopher say, tell me what a chair is. And I say, well, the thing with the four legs that you sit on. He said, well, what about this rug over here? I can sit on it. Is this not a chair?
And that's a perfectly good question, and it does get to the point is the chair is whatever you just decide to call a chair.
Yeah. What always strikes me as funny is some of the people who poo-poo philosophy and will nag us for, well, not me. I'm not a true philosopher, I guess, in the essentialist sense. But
Sorry, that's actually a good point. If you haven't gotten a PhD in philosophy, does that mean you're not a true philosopher and therefore you're just not qualified to talk about philosophy?
yeah, I can't give a non-biased answer to that. I don't give a crap what somebody's credentials are or the letters after the name. It just shows that they did the work in a shorthand. It's the same sort of shorthand we use everywhere else. But the people who poo-poo philosophers and what they do and what they think about, I've seen these same people argue over the definition of sport and whether it needs to include a ball, and just get incredibly heated. Hey, you're doing philosophy about sport and about meaning of terms as well.
So, and just to kind of wrap a few things up, speaking of philosophy, I kind of think Platonism is an interesting manifestation of essentialism, because you're talking about 1 + 1 = 2. To a Platonist, numbers literally exist. There is an essence of 1 and 2 that objectively exists out there in reality somewhere, and that's
outside
itself in the world.
I think that they're playing with the term exist. The debate that I did last weekend, I talked about this with regard to substance dualism and the idea that a god could exist outside of space-time. Because the normative use of the word exist, if we said something existed for 0 seconds and occupied 0 space, that usage of exist is indistinguishable from non-existence. And so there's some other, I said existy, that God or these Platonic ideals or the abstract concepts, they don't exist, but they existy in some existy-like sense of existence that's not in any way tied to what we normally mean by exist.
I think one kind of related problem to that is we use the word exists in mathematics, when really what we mean is an element of some set. Like if you look at the axioms for mathematics, or the Pinot axioms, where they'll just essentially say there exists a natural number called 0. And that, I think, confuses a lot of people, and they just think, well, numbers exist now, don't they? When really what you're saying is, I am defining a mathematical set that contains an element called 0. It doesn't exist, I've just defined words in relation to each other.
Yeah.
And that's a really hard idea to communicate to people about math. It's really just really formal definitions of things, but they're not out there. We didn't discover them, we defined them.
So I don't know that I'd say we didn't discover them.
Well, yes and no. You define the axioms, and then you discover facts about them by applying logic to your propositions. And then new propositions come out called theorems, and you're like, wow, that was interesting. So you can learn something new about something you invented, in a sense. So there is a mixture of discovery. The point I'm trying to make is, like you said earlier, about how poker, I think you said poker is, the rules are invented, but then you discover things about it after declaring and defining the rules. That's kind of a very good analogy to math.
I said chess, but poker works too.
Oh, chess, yeah.
I think what I was saying about discovery is that the concepts are, they are in some sense are synthetic as well. If you take an apple and slice it in half, it's clear that you have 2 halves of an apple. I know that the labels that we're putting on these are just pointers to concepts, but there's something demonstrable about it as well, about a practical application of the concept, I guess.
It is a useful way of navigating, but one kind of rebuttal that I have to that is, instead of an apple, what if you just have a rock? If I chop a rock down the middle, do I now have two halves of a rock, or do I just have two new rocks?
You have two halves of the rock that you had to begin with.
But you could also say, well, I just have two rocks now, because a rock is just a little hunk of granite, that fits in my hand. So I can actually get two out of one if I just think of it in those terms.
Yes,
so
but
not like,
now you're engaged in an equivocation fallacy, because the one in the first part is not the same as the one in the second part.
but we could do this forever. Where did that original rock come from? It broke off of a boulder off a mountain somewhere. So is that really one, or is it a chunk of a bigger one?
So it's relative. If you begin by defining one rock as this rock and you split it in half, yes, you have two rocks, but what you mean by rock in the conclusion is not the same as what you mean at the start. And it doesn't matter whether it fell off of a bigger rock, or whether, if you begin with one of the halves that you broke, and you begin with that as one rock that you're going to split, what the two rocks that you come up with after that quantity, or that label for rock, is not the same as where you started. That's where there's an equivocation fallacy.
Right. And what I'm trying to say is, at the end of the day, it's the rules of math are very precise. And when you officially set your axioms, this is one rock, now you have sort of rules for how to describe it after the fact, in a sense. But if you just don't really throw those labels at it, really I just say a rock is anything that kind of fits in my hand and made of granite, then it's perfectly okay to say when I chop a rock and down into a bunch of pieces, I now just have a bunch of rocks that came out of one rock.
Yeah, I would say
if I glue them all back together, is it now that rock again? Like, you can kind of play the Theseus game with this.
That rock plus glue.
Yeah. So again, the idea is there isn't an essence of two. It's I am using these rules of mathematics as a formal language for describing things. So I don't think I disagree with what you're saying. It's just you got to be careful of where is the objective essence of numbers coming from? Is it the rules we use to describe it, or are they just metaphysically there in the chunks of granite?
So let's say I put a deck of cards on the table, and that deck consists of 52 cards. And now we remove every mind from the universe.
Mm-hmm.
Are there still 52 cards there?
And that's an interesting question, because again, there's that essentialism that wants to say there's this essence of card that is there independent of my mind, and there's this essence of 52 that is there. But a more correct way to say is there is not 52 cards there. A better way to say it is, if I count the slivers of paper, I will count and arrive at 52 if I commit to those actions and follow rules. And I think that's maybe perhaps the way to describe it more rigorously than just saying...
Now I think you're confusing the map for the place.
Maybe.
You're focusing on the labels and not the abstract thing. So whatever we mean by 52, and it could be, in some other language it's something else. But that quantity, does the quantity of cards, does the quantity of those objects that we are defining as cards, remove every mind, does that quantity change, or does it remain the same in the absence of minds?
No, that's a very good question. I don't know if I have like a hard, ready-made answer for that.
Yeah, my contention is that it remains the same, and the only real argument for that is kind of an Occam's razor thing, that we have no good reason to think that anything substantive about it would change, quantity or otherwise, that the object is not contingent upon a human mind, and that quantity is the actual quantity, like the number of atoms, or the numbers are contingent upon our mind, but the quantity that it points to or not. I just don't like to say, along the lines of Platonists, that the quantity exists as a thing
unto itself.
Yeah, it's so this is the problem of abstract objects. So
well, you could get all quantum woo-woo on it and say if no mind is out there to count it, it's not measurable, and if something isn't measurable, it doesn't exist.
Or another way you could say it is, the quantity, this idea of quantity itself, is an intrinsically agent-directed thing. That when you say everybody in the universe is gone, well, does the quantity still exist? It's kind of like saying if everybody in the universe died and then a person came along and counted them, what would he get?
Yeah.
It almost isn't even meaningful, perhaps. Is that?
No. But let's say every mind ceased to exist. and then new minds evolved, and they stumbled upon there, and they recognized that this quantity of objects was 52 in whatever linguistic structures that they had. In the intervening time between when the last mind died out and the next new mind evolved to assess it, did that change?
I think a better way to ask the question is, if phrase it in terms of actions and consequences. If these new minds come in and follow the same rules that we have defined, will they get the same outcome?
Yeah,
that, I think, is a perfectly reasonable way to frame it, and I would say yes, absolutely. The quantity then stayed the same.
I think it's a perfectly reasonable way to phrase it too, but it avoids the entire issue of identity, which is what we were talking about.
Yeah,
it does something. Is the universe, and this is where we get back to the, what the bleep do we know? Is the universe contingent upon minds? And I don't think it is.
Mm-hmm.
No, it seemed to be very contingent without us for billions of years. Cars will be just as fine without us. Yeah.
Actually, I like your thought experiment because it kind of shows how it's very difficult to even describe the world without just giving things this definite essence to them. Like I had to do this massive linguistic shuffle in order to express the act of 52 cards, or the idea of 52 cards, in terms of something that doesn't endow it with an essence of 52, as opposed to there are actions and consequences that will objectively happen. When really, I could just bypass and say there are 52 cards there, and they'll just be there when I'm dead.
Yeah, and I'm fine with the idea of an essence of 52 that remains with that, not in a I'm not defining abstract concepts or abstract objects as existing in the same context. There's the physical, and then there's the conceptual, and there's a lot of philosophers. I mean, even Bertrand Russell and Quine and others accepted some version of Platonism for abstract objects. They were fine in the idea that these things exist. Now we're getting closer and closer to qualia, which we should just stop, because I find that to be an obnoxious conversation more than anything.
Does love exist, Matt?
Love is a label we put on a number of different things, actually. I get does love exist all the time from theists, and it ties into this.
I will say, for the entire conversation here, the underlying connection is labeling. And is it good labeling or is it bad labeling? And if you label something bad, you can get apparent paradoxes. And if something isn't adequately labeled enough, then you have confusion amongst different people. And
actually, that's a very good point. I have found myself having to explain this all the time. And I think a very short and concise way. I even have my own personal soundbite that I like to say. That is, there is no such thing as an objectively correct definition. There are only good definitions and bad definitions, where good definitions are consistent and expressive and representative of what people generally understand by a word when they think of it, whereas bad definitions fail in those goals.
Are they objectively good and bad?
Yes, because I can objectively speak of actions and consequences with respect to desires. So,
I'm with you. And actually, I think Chris's last comment was kind of the perfect summation of all this. That was exactly the case for all this discussion and all the discussions that have ever happened about this.
Yeah, so whenever you're getting into any kind of discussion with theist and atheist alike, it's no small feat to make sure that you share the same definitions before you argue anything, because without it, you're just talking to the walls there.
It's the reason I have difficulty giving short answers, because I am absolutely terrified of saying something and fostering confusion instead of clarity. And I think that short answers are really useful in some contexts and required in order for us to be productive. And they are poisonous when we're really trying to dig down to meaning and truth to the extent we can determine it.
The irony in that is I've actually seen Christians complain that atheists are too argumentative when it comes to definitions. when that's kind of the essence of good philosophy is, what do you mean by that? What can we agree on these words and what they ought to mean?
It frustrates me when somebody says, "Oh, well, I'm not interested because you guys are just having a semantic argument." Well, do you know what semantic means? Because those arguments are about meaning, and that's important.
Yeah.
Because if you don't share the meaning, you're done.
Yeah, I'm just babbling sounds at you, and you're not comprehending what I have to say. So we got to agree on a lexicon at some point.
Lexicon, well played.
Ooh. Smart. Okay, well, on that note, I think we've gone through all of our talking points and then some. So this has actually been a great discussion. I've had a lot of fun, and I just want to thank Matt for joining us. This has been a great contribution, and I like some of your new thought experiments. I'm going to go back and think about them a little. It's interesting.
Yeah.
Any closing remarks on essentialism before we wrap up?
Try and figure out why a diamond is more valuable than gravel.
Or charcoal. They're technically the same atoms,
Or
just
graphite.
slightly differently.
Yeah. And you know, you can talk about supply and demand, but then you have to get into why is there a demand? What is it about this particular thing that we cherish? Because there's no intrinsic.
Sparkle.
It's shiny, and that tells you a lot about our brain.
And it's really hard.
We can become so
Plastic
obsessed.
is shiny. Damn it.
We become so obsessed over shiny and pretty and things that are of value to us that we are prone to this thought that there must be something about it that encourages us. There must be some essence within it. And this is where people get to the idea of the divine. For the bulk of human existence, I think because of our concerns about ignorance and our fears about the unknown and death and other things, I think those are the reasons we've looked for answers. And what some people have done have said, because humanity has searched for the divine forever, there must then be some divine that is encouraging this search. And I think that is the magical thinking taken to extremes, because it seems far more reasonable to me that if there were something divine that was encouraging this search, we should have found it, or it should have made itself apparent by now. And the fact that we haven't tells us far more about who we are and what we think than it does about anything divine.
Charkopoulos, what are your closing thoughts? What he said.
Well, what he said, and I mean, come on. What's in the news
Wear
today?
the Hitler sweater or not? Come on.
Come on. It's only been around for 100 years that we've known of, and now we've found it, and we know it's right there and what color it is. Haha. So yeah, it's what he said.
Okay, then just a few remarks. This has been a discussion about essentialism, just the idea that objects and things have a very distinct objective essence to them that makes them what they are. And it's a very useful way of looking at the world, but you can also see how it is very easy to get carried away with it, and how it's almost impossible to even express yourself clearly without invoking these essentialist notions. So I hope that's been educational for everybody. I've had a good time, and thank you again, Matt, for joining us. So
Sure.
we'll be signing off now. Thank you.